He thought he was just an old man in a hat. A minute later, he was lying on his back in front of the whole hall. You won't believe what Chuck Norris did. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Write in the comments which city you're from. The hardwood floors of the Cross Judo Center gleamed beneath the soft overhead lights. Morning sun filtered in through tall, dustless windows, casting sharp, disciplined rectangles of light across the tatami mats. The air smelled of polish, sweat, and respect, or at least the kind cultivated under tight control. American flags and Japanese calligraphy hung side by side on the back wall, framed by rows of gleaming trophies and tournament photos. Each one featured the same confident face, Brent Cross, founder and head coach. Saturday mornings in the dojo followed a rigid rhythm. Children trained early, the teens came mid-morning, and the adult classes started just before noon. But today was a little different. A few parents lingered by the benches, cameras ready because Brent had announced it would be an open session, a day of showcasing excellence, reinforcing discipline, and reminding everyone why Cross Judo Center had a wait list and a reputation. Brent himself was already on the floor, warming up the students with crisp, sharp commands. He was in his early 40s, light-skinned, clean-cut, with an athletic build and a commanding voice. His black belt, embroidered in gold with his name and rank, hung like a banner around his waist. His gaze was hawk-like as he observed his students. His approval was not easily earned. "Watch your hips, Marcus," he barked across the room. "Don't muscle it. You let the body do the work. Flow, don't fight." The 15-year-old corrected his stance, cheeks red. Brent gave a short nod. The class moved on. All around, bodies pivoted and collided with practiced grace. Feet stomped, hands gripped, and breaths were controlled. The sound of throws echoed in satisfying thuds. Then the door opened. It wasn't loud, not even dramatic. Just a quiet creak and a breeze of fresh air that didn't belong. Heads turned, not all, but enough to notice, and the rhythm in the room faltered for half a second. He walked in like he belonged to another century. Tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered like the hills, the man stood out instantly. A well-worn cowboy hat cast a shadow across his lined face. He wore faded jeans, a checkered button-down shirt, and scuffed leather boots. His posture was upright, movements unhurried. He looked like he'd stepped off a ranch in the Panhandle and taken a wrong turn. Brent didn't look up at first, but murmurs spread, low and curious, as the man approached the benches, removed his boots with care, and sat down without a word. His eyes, pale and unreadable, scanned the room. He sat still, so still that it made others fidget. A teenage boy whispered, "Who's that?" "No idea," someone answered. Brent finally turned his gaze toward the figure. His expression didn't change, but a slight arch of the brow said all anyone needed to know. Intruder, disruption, joke. The man didn't smile. He didn't nod or explain himself. He simply watched the class with a kind of focused serenity that didn't match his age or his outfit. Brent strode to the edge of the tatami, just close enough to make sure the man heard him. "Welcome to Cross Judo," he called out, voice theatrical and bright. "You looking for someone, sir, or just in the wrong building?" There was a chuckle from the parents. A few students glanced nervously between the stranger and their coach. The man didn't move. He just offered a polite, "I'm here to observe." "Observe?" Brent echoed. "Sure, you wouldn't prefer the rodeo next door?" More laughter, louder this time. Brent grinned, basking in the moment. "We've got a strict dress code, you know. Usually includes a GI, not Wrangler denim." Still, the man said nothing. He folded his hands in his lap and turned his gaze back to the mats. If he heard the mockery, it didn't show. Brent gave a theatrical shrug. "All right then, watch and learn, cowboy." He turned back to the class, suddenly sharper in his movements. He demonstrated a sweeping hip throw on one of his senior students, landing with a flourish. The students clapped. The audience smiled. Brent was in his element, but the presence on the bench unsettled something. His students started glancing over more often. Their rhythm faltered. Brent's comments grew louder, jokes more biting. "I tell you what," he said to a younger student struggling with a foot sweep, "you'll land that throw before that old-timer figures out how to tie a belt." More laughs, but not from everyone. An assistant coach, an older man named Paul who had been with Brent since the gym's founding, narrowed his eyes at the stranger. There was something familiar in the way the man sat, the way he scanned the room with that silent, practiced attentiveness. He leaned over to the front desk clerk and whispered, "Pull up the Wi-Fi logs. I need a name." The stranger, oblivious or uncaring, remained in place. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He didn't blink more than necessary. He watched the throws. He watched the footwork. He observed the instructor, and slowly, without speaking a word, he became the focus of the room. One of the older teens, a brown belt named Isaac, whispered, "He's watching like he's been here before." The class continued, but tension crept in like fog. Brent's performance took on a defensive edge. His throws became more aggressive, his corrections more cutting. His gaze flickered back to the man in the hat more than he would admit. At the end of the class, as students bowed out and lined up, Brent clapped his hands and turned to face the bench. "So, cowboy," he said, arms crossed, voice rising, "did we impress you? Or were we doing it all wrong according to Texas ranch law?" The man rose, smooth and steady. He picked up his hat, dusted it lightly, and placed it on his head. Only then did he speak, quietly but clearly. "Not wrong," he said, "just hurried." Brent's smile tightened. "Hurried? You got notes for me, sir?" "Just an observation," the man replied. "You teach them to fall, that's good, but do you teach them when not to rise?" "What the hell does that mean?" Brent shot back, half laughing. The man turned to leave, and that was when Brent made the mistake. "Hey," he called after him, "you ever set foot on a mat in your life, or do you just walk into dojos to make riddles?" The man stopped. Dead silence. Even the parents felt the air shift. The stranger turned slowly. "I've stepped on many mats." "In those boots?" Brent scoffed. The man walked back toward the tatami, removed his hat, set it gently on the bench, and stepped to the edge of the mat, socks brushing the surface. "I'm not here to prove anything," he said, "but I won't be insulted either." Brent laughed. "Oh, I see. You want a demonstration?" "I don't want anything," the man said softly, "but you seem to." There was a moment of stunned stillness. Then Brent nodded toward the center of the mat. "Minute on the mat, cowboy," he said. "1 minute. If you last that long, I'll buy you a cup of coffee and stop cracking jokes. You fall before that. You walk out and never come back. Fair?" The man said nothing. He stepped calmly onto the tatami. Brent looked at his students, then at the parents, grinning like a performer before a trick. "Let's have some fun," he said, but Paul, the assistant, was no longer smiling. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the screen in front of him. A name was there, simple, unmistakable. He looked up just as the man in the cowboy hat straightened his back and nodded in silence. And Paul whispered under his breath, not to anyone in particular. Oh my God, it's really him. The mat had never felt quieter. Brent Cross prided himself on control of his class, his dojo, his image, and especially the narrative within those walls. For years he had shaped every moment on the mat like a craftsman laying brick. Deliberate, perfect, powerful. He trained students not just to fall and rise, but to make him look good in the process. So when the man in denim and a checkered shirt stepped onto the mat without flinching, without stammering, Brent felt something in the air shift. Just slightly, but enough to itch under his skin. There was a buzz in the dojo that hadn't been there before. A flicker of anticipation. The kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, but a quiet before thunder. The students, still lined up from the end of class, didn't move. Even the parents, usually quick to gather their children and slip out, remained frozen. Phones were being pulled out again, but slower this time, less as jokes, more as documentation. The stranger, still without GI, still in his rolled-up sleeves and worn jeans, stepped into the center of the tatami with the kind of calm Brent hadn't seen in anyone outside of a master. He moved like gravity itself acknowledged him. It made Brent's chest tighten just slightly. He shook it off. "Okay, then," Brent said, flashing his trademark grin. "1 minute. That's all you have to last. Don't worry, I'll go easy." The man didn't smile. He simply gave a slight respectful nod and waited. No stance, no ready pose. Just presence. Brent turned to his students, arms wide like a game show host. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Cowboy Throwdown begins now." He tapped his wrist dramatically. "Clock starts now." But he didn't move. Neither did the man. The first seconds ticked by with nothing more than stillness. Brent bounced on the balls of his feet, grinning, pretending to look for an opening. Inside, something clenched. That presence. It wasn't fading. It was growing heavier. He lunged. It wasn't reckless. Brent knew better than that. He moved fast, low, smart, going for a quick sweep, something to knock the man off balance and put him down early. The crowd needed closure. He needed control. But as he pivoted to execute, his leg met nothing. The stranger was already gone, not with a dodge, but a shift. So economical, it looked like magic. Brent's knee scraped the mat. He recovered quickly, hiding the stumble with a chuckle. "Slippery," he said. "Nice." Still, the man didn't speak. Brent circled. This time he went higher. Feint, grab, hip entry. Classic throw. It would work on any judoka, trained or not. But the moment his hands reached for the man's upper body, something shifted again. A gentle push redirected him. It didn't feel like force. It felt like redirection by water. His feet lifted off the ground before his mind registered it. He landed on his back. Clean, controlled, not hard, but irrefutable. A gasp rippled across the dojo. He blinked up at the ceiling, breath caught. The stranger stood beside him, calm, neutral. He extended a hand. Brent didn't take it. He scrambled to his feet, face flushed. "Lucky," he said, forcing a laugh. "You got one. Let's go again." No answer. He charged, this time with weight, strength, fury, no restraint. A double-leg takedown attempt combined with shoulder pressure, enough to topple even a collegiate wrestler. But again, the man didn't resist. He stepped aside with a pivot so light it seemed preordained. Brent felt his own momentum betray him. Then, from the side, an arm coiled under his, and with a single fluid shift of the hips, Brent soared. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy, but he was airborne. And then, impact. This time the mat thudded under his full weight. His breath whooshed from his lungs. The room remained dead silent. Brent rolled over, dazed, heartbeat pulsing in his ears. The stranger stepped back, giving him space, hands by his sides. The clock beeped softly. 1 minute had passed. Someone clapped. It was Paul, the assistant coach. The clap echoed like a firecracker. Others followed, slow, hesitant, then growing in rhythm, not mocking, not even celebratory. Something quieter, respectful. Brent sat up, heat flushing across his face and scalp. He saw the students, their eyes, the change in them. Something was unraveling in his chest and he couldn't stop it. The stranger bowed low and proper. Brent didn't move, didn't speak. He watched the man walk off the mat, pick up his hat, and gently place it back on his head. A few students instinctively moved aside, clearing a path. The man nodded once toward Paul, who nodded back with something like reverence. As he approached the door, Brent stood. "Wait," he said. The room quieted again. The man turned. Brent cleared his throat, voice steadier than he expected. What's your name?" There was a long pause. Then the man said, "Chuck," and walked out the door. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Brent's knees ached, his ego bruised beyond recognition, but something deeper was beginning to burn beneath the embarrassment. A flicker of recognition. The name was too simple, too ordinary, but it landed in his brain like a dropped stone into still water. He turned to Paul. "Chuck?" Paul nodded slowly. "Chuck Norris." A murmur spread like wildfire. Phones were already being consulted. A senior student whispered, "It's him. Look at the video from the 80s. Same stance, same posture." Brent sat down on the mat, suddenly more tired than he'd felt in years. Outside, Chuck Norris was already halfway down the street, the morning sun catching on the brim of his hat. He didn't look back. Inside, Brent stared at the middle of the tatami, the place where he'd just been tossed like a child in front of his students. Not with violence, not with arrogance, but with grace and absolute control. His pride was cracked, his authority shaken. And still, beneath it all, there was no anger. Only silence and the beginning of a very loud realization. The students gathered near Paul, who quietly explained what he knew about Tang Soo Do, about the films, the competitions, the service records, about the decades Chuck Norris had spent teaching not to impress, but to elevate others. Some students sat down right on the mat, cross-legged, as if waiting for something more to unfold. Brent stood again, dusting off his GI. The fabric felt heavier now, not because of weight, but because of meaning. He looked at his students. Their faces no longer held fear or idol worship. They looked for answers. He had none. Not yet. But maybe that was the first step. He glanced at the wall of trophies, his face in frame after frame, victories frozen in time. None of them taught him as much as what had just happened in 60 seconds. Then he said something no one expected. "Class isn't over." They turned to him. He gestured to the center. Everyone back on the mat. There was a beat. Then, like tide returning to shore, they obeyed. He bent to tie his belt tighter. Not for show, for grounding, and this time he didn't stand in front of them. He stood with them. The air inside the Cross Judo Center hung heavier than usual the following Saturday. Even though the windows let in the same golden light and the mats had been scrubbed to the same pristine standard, there was a silence among the students that hadn't existed before. It was not discomfort exactly, but something unspoken, the kind of atmosphere that settles in the wake of a truth too undeniable to ignore. The walls of the dojo, once filled with Brent Cross's voice and the rhythmic impact of training, now echoed with the weight of memory. Brent stood in the office, tying the knot of his black belt slower than usual. His reflection in the mirror across from him seemed foreign, like a version of himself just a few years older, a little more hollow. His hands, once so sure, now moved more deliberately. He didn't want to make a mistake. Not with the belt, not with the posture, not with the day ahead. He had hardly slept all week. The video had gone viral, of course. Dojo regulars and outsiders alike had posted clips online, labeled things like Cowboy School's arrogant sensei or Old Man Flips Judo champ with one hand. Brent had tried not to read the comments, but he had. He remembered each one like paper cuts on his pride. But something else lingered deeper than the sting of public embarrassment. It was the quietness in Chuck's eyes before that first throw. Not confidence, not arrogance, just presence. That was what haunted Brent most. He hadn't been beaten by a trick or a gimmick. He had been outclassed in a way that left no room for ego. Now, every time he walked onto the tatami, he felt that same presence in the air, like it had left an imprint that couldn't be scrubbed away. Even his students were different. They watched him differently. Not with less respect, but with a new kind. Something more curious, more cautious, more real. The illusion of invincibility had broken. In its place was a man. He exited the office and stepped onto the mat. The students had already lined up, but not in their usual fidgeting way. They stood straighter, eyes more focused. He noticed Isaac among them, the brown belt who had spoken Chuck's name aloud. Paul stood by the wall, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. The usual routine was waiting for his command. Brent took a breath. "Line drills," he said, "but slow, with control." The students obeyed. One by one, they began moving across the mat. Forward rolls, backward rolls, break falls. Brent watched every movement, and though he corrected a few here and there, his voice was less sharp, more precise. He walked among them, not ahead of them, and then, halfway through a series of footwork drills, the front door creaked open again. Brent turned without thinking. Every head in the dojo followed. There he was. Chuck stepped inside just as he had the week before. Hat in hand, same calm step, same steady presence. He didn't speak. He nodded politely toward the room and removed his boots. His clothes were different today. Still denim jeans, but with a dark gray shirt instead of the checkered one. Still not a gi. Still unmistakably himself. No one laughed this time. Brent didn't speak for a moment. Then he called out across the mat, not loudly, but clearly. "You came back." Chuck nodded. "Just to observe." Brent hesitated, then gestured toward the edge of the mat. "You're welcome to." Chuck took a seat on the bench where he had sat before. But this time the energy in the room shifted not with confusion or mockery, but with gravity. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn down the middle of the dojo, the space before and the space after. Brent let the students continue their drills. He tried to stay focused, but he could feel Chuck's gaze like a silent metronome, measuring not his skill but his center. After 20 minutes, he called a break. The students sat along the wall, drinking water, wiping sweat. Brent stayed standing. He looked at the space before him, the soft surface of the tatami. He thought of how it had felt to be flipped so easily, so gently, like wind passing over leaves. He turned to Chuck. "Would you demonstrate something?" Chuck's brow raised slightly. Brent nodded toward the center. "With me. One throw for the class." There was a long pause. Then Chuck stood. He walked with no hurry. When he stepped onto the mat, he bowed, not to Brent, but to the dojo itself. Brent did the same. They faced each other. The students didn't move. Paul stepped forward with his phone, but after a beat, lowered it again. Brent took a stance. Chuck didn't. Brent inhaled. He stepped forward with a traditional grip, lapel and sleeve, firm but not forceful. Chuck allowed it. His body didn't resist, it adapted. Brent tried a feint, a hip turn, a suggestion of a foot sweep. Chuck's response was immediate, yet almost invisible. A shift in his weight, a change in tension that made Brent abandon the movement before it began. Brent tried again, this time more committed. He rotated his hips, dropped his center, attempted to initiate an uchimata. He was halfway through the motion when he realized he was no longer in control. Chuck had not blocked. He had guided. A palm pressed gently to the small of Brent's back, a shift of Chuck's foot inside his lead leg, and Brent was lifted, lightly, cleanly, and placed on his back with precision. The dojo was silent. The fall had not been loud. It had been perfect. Brent lay there for a breath, staring at the ceiling. This time he didn't feel shame. He felt clarity. Chuck stepped back, allowed him space. Brent sat up, then stood. He looked at his students. Did anyone see what he did? No one spoke. Chuck answered, "Position, not force." Brent nodded. "Show them." For the next 15 minutes, Chuck walked the students through the same throw, slowly, carefully. He let them feel his balance, his weight, his center. He didn't explain with words. He showed with presence. He adjusted posture. He guided hands. He moved like a stone in water, always stable, always flowing. Even the youngest students began to understand. It wasn't about aggression. It wasn't about dominance. It was about alignment, timing, awareness. Afterward, as the students practiced in pairs, Brent watched from the edge. Paul approached. "He humbled you," Paul said. "He reminded me," Brent replied. "Of what?" "That martial arts aren't about winning," Brent said. "They're about not needing to." They stood in silence for a moment. Chuck returned to the bench, sat again, folded his hands. Brent walked over. "Thank you," he said, "for teaching my students." Chuck looked at him. They were already learning. Brent hesitated. "And me?" Chuck gave the faintest smile. "You're ready to start." Brent looked down at his belt. For the first time in his life, he saw it not as a destination, but a reminder. He turned back to his students and called the class back together. "We'll be doing something different today," he said. "Pair off. Brown belts with white, black belts with yellow. We're going to learn from each other." There were murmurs, then nods. Brent walked across the mat and sat beside Chuck. "You're welcome here any time," he said. "I won't need to be," Chuck replied. Brent looked confused. "They've seen it now," Chuck said. "They'll carry it forward." Brent watched his students, learning, stumbling, growing. He nodded. Chuck stood, bowed again to the mat, and gathered his things. As he walked to the door, Isaac jogged up to him. "Are you really Chuck Norris?" he asked, breathless. Chuck tilted his head. "I'm just someone who never stopped learning," he said. Then he stepped outside into the afternoon sun and disappeared once more. Inside the dojo, something had changed forever. Not because someone had won, but because someone had shown what it means not to need to. The dojo didn't look different on the outside. The banner still hung over the entrance, clean and taut. The wooden sign with the words Cross Judo Center carved in bold serif font still greeted parents and passers-by with the same professional confidence. Inside, the tatami mats remained neatly arranged. The framed photographs and tournament accolades still adorned the far wall, and the same crisp sandalwood-scented air greeted each student who passed through the sliding glass doors. But for those who trained inside, Everything had changed. The morning after Chuck Norris had returned, demonstrated, and disappeared once more, Brent Cross sat alone in the empty dojo. The students wouldn't arrive for another hour, and Paul had yet to unlock the front desk. Brent knelt on the tatami in silence, hands on his thighs, spine straight. He had done the same posture thousands of times before, often as performance, often as formality. But today it was something else. A practice. A posture of stillness, not structure. He thought of the moment Chuck had thrown him. Not because of the throw itself. He had been thrown before many times. It was how he had been thrown. No strain, no collision, no conquest. The move had felt like gravity simply rerouting itself, as if Brent's balance had chosen to betray him on its own, just waiting for a gentler hand to show it how. The knot in Brent's chest that had tightened for years, through competitions, through teaching, through the endless chase of dominance and perfection, was finally beginning to loosen. Chuck hadn't defeated him. He had disarmed something deeper, the illusion that mastery was about control over others rather than understanding of self. The front door opened with a soft chime. Brent didn't look up. "You're early," Paul said. "I wanted quiet," Brent replied. Paul walked across the tatami with the grace of someone who had trained longer than most people had been alive. He knelt beside Brent, neither speaking for a while. Outside, traffic hummed in the background. Inside, stillness reigned. "He's not coming back, is he?" Paul eventually asked. Brent shook his head. "No, he said his part is done." Paul sighed. "What now?" Brent turned to look at the far wall, the one where his framed certificates and action shots hung in perfect symmetry. His own eyes stared back at him from the glossy glass, younger, prouder, stiffer. "I don't know yet," Brent said, "but I think it starts with listening." When the students arrived, there was no announcement, no new speech, no grand change. Brent simply shifted his posture in class. He corrected less and watched more. When he spoke, it was not to instruct but to invite. He asked questions. He listened to answers. The first few days were awkward. Some students hesitated, unsure what had happened to their once fearless leader, but they adapted, and so did he. The black belts noticed it first. His instructions were still clear, but no longer absolute. He asked them to reflect on their movements, to explain what they felt, not just what they executed. One evening, he led a drill where brown belts paired with white belts and simply listened to each other's footwork. "This isn't how we used to train," Isaac whispered to his partner. "No," the partner replied, "but it feels real." 1 week later, a new practice appeared on the schedule. Kansha Keiko, practice of gratitude. It was optional. No GI required. No hierarchy of belts. No spectators. Students came in regular clothes, sat in a circle, and spoke about their training. Not what they had mastered, but what they were learning to unlearn. It was Paul's idea to hang the photo. No one had captured a clear shot of Chuck's throw, at least not one that wasn't grainy, taken from the wrong angle, or blurred by motion. But someone had taken a picture just after. Chuck standing, calm and composed, hat under one arm, while Brent sat upright on the mat, looking up not in defeat, but in recognition. The photo was framed and mounted near the exit, not where trophies went, but where shoes were left. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "True strength is not in standing tallest, but in kneeling with dignity." Brent didn't sign it. Chuck hadn't asked for it, but no one ever questioned its placement. One afternoon, after class had ended and the dojo had emptied, Brent sat on the edge of the mat and watched a group of younger students put away equipment. They moved without being asked, folding GIs, rolling mats, returning training weapons to their wall-mounted racks. There was a natural rhythm to it, like breath. Isaac lingered nearby. "You're quiet lately," he said. "I have more to hear than to say," Brent replied. Isaac tilted his head. "You used to push harder." Brent smiled gently. "And what did that teach you?" Isaac thought for a moment. "How to perform." "And now?" "Now I'm learning how to feel." Brent nodded. "Good, that's harder." Isaac sat beside him, glancing at the photo by the door. "Do you think he was always like that?" he asked. "No," Brent said. "I think he got there by not pretending he already was." Paul walked over, holding an old belt, faded, fraying, its once black color dulled to a charcoal gray. "Found this in the storage closet," he said. "Used to be yours." Brent took it, turning it over in his hands. He had earned it after a national tournament nearly 15 years earlier. He remembered how it had felt then, like proof. Now it felt like a question. He stood and walked to the middle of the mat. Quietly, he placed the old belt on the ground. Some students noticed. Others simply paused, sensing something ceremonial. "I won't wear this anymore," Brent said. No one moved. "It means something," he continued, "but not what I thought. It told me how long I'd trained, but it never told me how deeply I'd listened. It told others that I was their teacher, but it never asked me if I was still learning." He looked up. "From now on, I'll wear white, until I forget how to pretend." No applause followed. No speeches were made. But when he walked off the mat, leaving the old belt folded where he had once stood to command, Paul simply bowed. That evening, after the students had left and the mats had been cleaned, Brent sat in the office alone. The dojo was dark except for one light above the desk. He opened a notebook, empty, fresh, untouched. On the first page, he wrote, "Lesson 1. When the mind stops resisting, the body begins to understand." Then he closed the notebook and turned off the light. In the days that followed, the dojo took on a new rhythm. Classes ran as before, but with more space between drills, more breath between movement. Students lingered longer after training. Some began asking questions Brent hadn't heard in years. Why do we bow? What's the purpose of stillness? Can a throw be kind? One 12-year-old girl asked, "Does being strong mean you don't cry?" Brent didn't answer right away. Then he said, "No, it means you know when to." During a particularly humid afternoon class, one of the beginner students misstepped during randori and accidentally collided with another. It wasn't serious, just a tangled fall, but the boy who had fallen began to cry, embarrassed. Brent walked over and knelt beside him. "Do you know what judo means?" he asked softly. The boy nodded, sniffling. "Gentle way." "And do you think it's gentle only when things go right?" The boy shook his head. "Then this moment," Brent said, "is still judo." The boy stared at him for a beat, then wiped his face, stood up, and bowed. Isaac watched from the side, the image imprinting itself in the muscle memory of his heart. One night, after the dojo had locked up, Brent and Paul sat outside beneath a wooden overhang. The evening breeze stirred the trees. The air smelled of pine and chalk. "I miss the old days sometimes," Paul admitted. "The trophies, the crowds." "So do I," Brent replied, "but not the part of me I had to be to get them." "You're building something new now." Brent nodded. "Something I might actually be proud of when no one's watching." Paul looked toward the parking lot. "You think he'll ever come back?" Brent shook his head. He already left what he came to give. And what was that? Brent leaned back, exhaled. A mirror, he said. One I was finally ready to look into. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees. Inside the dojo, under the dim night lights, the white belt Brent now wore hung from its peg, untied, unassuming, a reminder that even those who've climbed the highest still have paths worth walking from the beginning. On the first Saturday of the month, the morning sun filtered through the dojo's paper-smooth windows just as it always had, casting long rectangles of light across the tatami. The building stood in the same spot it always had, nestled between a quiet strip mall and a row of oaks shedding their early autumn leaves. To any outsider passing by, there was nothing remarkable about the Cross Judo Center that day. No banners, no fanfare, no press. But inside, something unseen shifted. A rhythm, a spirit, a posture that belonged not to show or spectacle, but to something deeper. Brent Cross stood at the edge of the mat, adjusting the belt of his plain white gi. The belt around his waist matched the uniform, white, with no stripes or embroidery. To the untrained eye, he looked like a beginner, but there was something in his posture, in the calm of his breath, and the openness of his gaze that made it clear he was anything but. He looked over the room. Today was the first of what he had quietly called days without rank. It wasn't on any flyer, and no formal announcement had been made. There were no colored belts on the mats, no distinctions between brown and white, black and yellow. The belts were tucked away in the cubbies, folded neatly. On this day, everyone trained without title. Students filtered in, some hesitant, some curious. They wore clean white GIs with no markings. Some of the younger ones glanced nervously at Brent, uncertain whether this was a mistake. But when they saw their usual instructors dressed the same, their faces began to relax. Brent greeted each student with a nod and a smile. He didn't speak unless spoken to. His voice had softened since that first encounter with Chuck Norris. Not out of fear or shame, but out of choice. He had discovered the space between words and what it could hold. Paul entered last, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. He gave Brent a small nod and stepped to the far side of the mat where he sat siesta and closed his eyes. Brent joined him. Slowly, students followed, forming a wide circle around the room. No commands were given, no hierarchy imposed, only shared breath and the soft creak of the building settling around them. A few minutes passed in silence before Brent spoke. "Today," he said gently, "we listen to the body." No further instructions followed. Pairs began to form naturally, students gravitating toward others without looking for rank or permission. They bowed and began to move, slowly, carefully, exploring techniques not as competitions to be won, but as conversations to be held. The mat came alive with a new kind of rhythm. There were no shouts, no loud landings. The throws, where they occurred, were quiet and fluid, as though the earth itself was cradling each fall. Students helped each other up not with the efficiency of drilled habit, but with the mindfulness of partners. Brent observed, adjusting a student's stance here, guiding a shoulder there. He moved like a gardener, tending rather than commanding. For every correction he gave, he paused first, watching, waiting, listening. One pair caught his eye. Isaac, the brown belt, and a new student who had joined only 2 weeks earlier. The boy's movements were raw and imprecise. He fumbled with grips and hesitated during transitions. Isaac, once known for his speed and intensity, now matched his partner's pace, allowing room for uncertainty. He didn't correct harshly or overreach. He simply adjusted with each mistake, offering stability without domination. Brent watched them for several minutes, feeling something quietly stir in his chest. Not pride in the traditional sense, no conquest, no ranking, but something deeper. The satisfaction of transmission, of having passed along something worth keeping. Later that afternoon, the class gathered in a seated circle once more. Sweat glistened on brows, but no one seemed hurried to leave. Brent looked around. "What did you notice today?" A young woman raised her hand. "I didn't worry about being right." A boy in the back said, "I didn't even think about winning." Another voice added, "It was easier to feel when I stopped trying to prove." Brent nodded. He waited before speaking again. "We bow every class," he said, "to tradition, to the mat, to each other. But today you bowed to something more." He paused. "You bowed to silence." Paul looked up from his place near the door. "And, in silence," he said, "we hear what noise can't teach." After class, the students filed out slowly, conversations muted but meaningful. Many of them lingered, folding mats, straightening corners, offering help without being asked. Brent stayed behind, sweeping the edges of the floor with a long-handled broom. The photo of Chuck Norris still hung near the exit. Over the past weeks, it had become something of a quiet icon. Not idolized, not dramatized. Simply present. A reminder. Some students touched the edge of the frame as they passed, not reverently, but as if acknowledging something familiar. Brent walked up to the photo after the last student had gone. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he turned and went into his office. On the wall behind his desk hung rows of medals and certificates. Trophies lined a shelf in descending order of size. For years, they had represented achievement, conquest, supremacy. But now they felt like echoes of an earlier chapter, important, but no longer dominant. He opened a cabinet and removed a new wooden plaque. Unfinished, untitled, blank. He set it on the desk and opened his notebook, the one he had begun the day after Chuck's visit. On the next empty page, he wrote, Lesson 4. Leadership is not the weight of being followed. It is the discipline of walking well. He closed the notebook, then stood and reached for the blank plaque. He carved the words himself, slowly, one letter at a time. No embellishment, no logo, just 5 words. The quiet is stronger than words. That evening, as the last of the students left, Brent mounted the plaque beneath the photo. It didn't draw attention. It didn't need to. The next week, the dojo carried on. Classes resumed as scheduled. Students came and went. The mat was filled with falls and rises, laughter and struggle. But something had taken root. One morning, a father of a young student approached Brent at the entrance. "I've been watching your class," he said. "It's different now." Brent waited. "Before," the man continued, "my daughter would come home and talk about moves, drills, wins. Now she talks about breath, balance, listening." Brent smiled. "She's learning faster than I did." The man nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you." Brent bowed. "Thank you for letting her lead." That afternoon, after the dojo emptied, Brent walked into the training space and stood alone on the tatami. He closed his eyes, hands by his sides. For several minutes, he didn't move. The building creaked around him, the wood and plaster adjusting to the late-day sun. A breeze touched the windows. Dust motes danced in the light. He opened his eyes, stepped forward, and bowed deeply to the mat. No one was there to see it. But something responded. He turned and walked slowly toward the door. Before stepping out, he glanced once more at the photo. The man in denim and a hat, the teacher without ceremony, the thrower of truths. Brent didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped outside into the golden light and let the door fall gently shut behind him. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video right here, and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.